Okay, welcome to Module 3. Today we are going to talk about podcasts. Had a very interesting chat yesterday with somebody I had reached out to. I got their name from a mutual friend, and we just had a fabulous conversation and created a great joint venture. I'm going to talk about that a little later on. Essentially, we're going to look at the whole area of podcasting today. First of all, why you would want to be in a podcast. It's not always that obvious, and there are a lot of things that you can do after you've been on a podcast a lot of people forget about. We're going to look at doing the research before you even reach out to podcasts. We're going to talk about how you make your approach, and usually there are two different ways. One is if you've never spoken to the person or you don't have an introduction to that person. And the other option is if you have kind of a warm lead where you have an introduction, or even a hot lead where you've met the person already and they know who you are. And then we're going to finish off with, assuming that you get the podcast and become a guest, what do you do when you're on the interview? So let us get started. So first of all, the why access podcast. Now, I know a lot of people will just jump to the conclusion, well, because it gets me in front of a lot of people, and that's true. But there are a lot of other reasons, and you need to have this kind of in the back of your mind in order to be able to leverage the podcast and get the most out of it. So, of course, the first thing that you're going to get by being a guest on a podcast is having publicity for your product, your service, or your brand. Being able to talk very often at length about yourself, why you entered your business, a little bit about your background and how you came to do what you're doing, what it is that you do, how you've developed it. Might even be if you're somebody with a product looking for investors, you can talk about that. So there are a lot of different reasons that you would want to be on a podcast and a lot of different ways to leverage it afterwards. The big thing that I find about podcasts that makes them a bit different from a lot of other media outlets is that they're usually very niche oriented. Each person who has set up their podcast, every host, has in mind a certain kind of market or audience that is listening to the podcast. And so identifying the correct audiences for yourself will enable you to pick the podcast that will get you in front of the best market for you. So, if you're looking for people who have a podcast that is directed to entrepreneurs, then it's very simple to align your product or service with that audience. If you're looking for single mothers with children, there are podcasters out there who are delivering information and messaging specifically to that audience. So podcasts are great when you want to access a niche audience. Using recordings afterwards to demonstrate your credibility. So this is really important when you want to start broadening your brand and getting out to a lot of different media outlets that might be looking for the credibility around your ability to do an interview. So even if it's a print publication, and of course, especially if you're looking to get on radio or television, or other podcasts, very often they will ask for samples of your work. And so if you have a recording of a podcast, you can put that link into an email or put the podcast on your media page. And by being able to have that available for people looking for it, they can see right away, how does this person talk? Do they answer questions directly? Are they entertaining? Are there a lot of ums and ahs? Do they come across as confident or insecure? Do they allow for what we call good clips? So if I'm creating, let's say, what we call in broadcast, it's often called a broadcast feature or piece where I'm going to take an interview and break it up and use it along with my own narration. I want to be able to take little clips from that person. So if you're somebody who drones on and on and on, you're not somebody that gives good clip. However, if you talk in small bullet points, if you pause and allow the other person to get a word in and to ask other questions, then other media outlets will find that attractive, because it means that basically you're giving a good interview. And I think there's probably nothing worse in the world if I were on radio interviewing somebody and they just kept going on and I couldn't get a word in. It would come across really badly, because if I tried to interrupt, I might appear to be rather rude, and it would be awkward for me to be able to conduct the interview. So from the point of view of a media decision maker, they want to be able to see how good is that person. And then finally, as I mentioned, with a recording of the podcast, you can put that everywhere. Put it on your media page, put it on your website, put it in your emails, put it in your social media. So easy to make a link to it. But I always warn people, try not to link to somebody else's page. See if you can get the recording of the podcast for yourself and put it into your own marketing. Put it onto your own website, put it onto your own media page. Because you don't want to find out a year from now that the host has deleted the material. Same thing goes when you're looking at media outlets like television or radio, where very often every year there's an automatic review of pages. And if that page didn't get a lot of hits, they just delete it. So rather than taking that chance, see if you can get a copy beforehand, like ask beforehand if you can get a copy. Get the download and put it on someplace where you know it's going to exist for a long time. All right, so here's what we're going to go through today in terms of the checklist. Really important, and I urge you to print this out, take a screenshot, make notes, because if you go through this step by step, it'll really improve your chances of being asked to come on as a guest. So the first thing you want to do is know your host. Then you're going to figure out, how do I create my message in a way that's very succinct, that explains what I do, not too much, not too little, demonstrating your credibility. Why are you the one that the host should interview? Being able to offer something that's new or changing, something that's different about you, something unique, and very often something fun or entertaining. So podcasts, unlike other broadcast media, podcasts are generally longer interviews. The shortest podcast I've ever done was 12 minutes. The longest one was an hour. So it's very hard to sustain an audience if you're just droning on at a monotone level, or what you say is just very factual, and you don't have some entertaining quality about it. So being able to convey that when you're pitching to a podcast host is really important. Are there transferable lessons? So this is one of the most important things across all media. No matter who you're pitching to, you want to keep in mind, what is the audience going to be looking for? Is there something that you can provide that is going to teach them something? Very important, especially when you're dealing with podcasts where the audience is made up of entrepreneurs or small business owners that are looking to grow their business. They're looking to learn something. So you have to think, how do you convey those transferable lessons when you're doing a pitch? And finally, this is the kind of je ne sais quoi. Why is it that you're going to be a great guest? What is it about you, again, that's very different, that makes you a little bit more special than somebody else? Something that will sort of seal the deal, as it were. So to know your host, so important, because as I'm going to mention later, finding out a little bit more about your host than just what you might see on their Facebook profile or LinkedIn profile is so important. So first, you want to listen to the podcast. You want to get a feel for what is the type of content, who are the speakers that come on, what is the common element between them. So for example, the person that I spoke to, Bijan, this is somebody who does podcasts for entrepreneurs, but he has a special angle to it. As I listened to several of the podcasts, I realized he really likes talking about the challenges that his guests have overcome and how they are contributing to the world. Not necessarily, volunteering overseas or something like that, but how do they make other people's lives better? So knowing that really helped me when I created my pitch. And if I had just looked at his profile, I probably wouldn't have gotten that information. What's also important to know is how the host asks questions. Being able to see, do they ask a lot of questions? Are they going to let you speak at your own pace and just go on for 5, 6, 10, 15 minutes? How do they actually construct the interview? This is going to be important when I talk about dealing with the interview later on. So if you actually get an interview on a podcast, you want to know how to manage the interview to the best of your abilities. So seeing beforehand how other interviews were conducted is really important. And also, when you go through their podcasts and listen to them, you can actually refer back to some of the content, which is really great for any media outlet, again, demonstrating that you understand the media outlet, that you've actually read the magazine, watched the television show, looked at the website, looked at their Instagram stream, whatever it is. You want to demonstrate that you haven't just picked their name out of a hat and now you're throwing out a pitch. Make it more custom oriented, because that gives the media decision maker an understanding that you've done your work and you're not just throwing broadcast pitches to everybody. When I worked at Business in Vancouver, one of the things I really disliked is when people would send me a pitch and it was quite clearly not relevant for our newspaper. So it demonstrated to me that they hadn't done their homework, and even just opening that email, taking a couple of minutes to read it, was for me a waste of my time, which obviously as a media person with a lot of things to do, we don't want to waste time. Looking at the tone would be the next thing. So generally, a business-oriented podcast is going to be a little bit more professional, sticking to facts, talking about, as I mentioned, what you do in your business, what you've learned through your life, and it's something where you don't really have to be that much of a character, so to speak. If it's a podcast about life hacks, they might be looking for people who are very entertaining, a lot of joking going around, and it's quite a different tone, between the two. That isn't to say if you're being interviewed by somebody who has a podcast for entrepreneurs that you want to be ultra serious. Obviously, you want to be entertaining as well, and if you can bring in humor, all even better. But just be cautious that you're not bringing to the interview something that's inappropriate. So not too serious for podcasts that are more humorous or entertaining, and not too crazy for podcasts that are a little more professional. And then as you listen to the podcast as well, be aware of where the host is surprised. What are the things that make them say things like, wow, I didn't know that, or oh, that's really interesting, or I'm really curious about that, tell me more. Or even things like, oh, I do that all the time. Get to know the host so that as you're pitching and then later when you're doing the interview, you can make the content really relevant. So you're speaking their language. Same thing as I tell everybody pitching to every media outlet. Think of the media outlet as a client. You wouldn't just throw things at the client before finding out what their needs are and finding out more about them. So this is all the same thing when you're looking at knowing your host. Find out as much as you can. Treat the media outlet like a client. Learn about their background. Learn about what makes them tick. Learn about their needs and their wants and their curiosities. And that will make it easier for you to write a pitch that's going to be accepted. Now we get to the beginning of the pitch to know what you do. Now this is something I'm always surprised about, even to this day, with all the people going to networking events and standing up and doing their 15 and 30-second intro. People still spend too much time in writing at length about what they do and not getting to the point. So I always suggest getting this down to 1 or 2 succinct sentences. Now, I want to be clear. There are certain emails, and I'll refer to it when you have kind of a warm lead. You can be a little bit more chatty and talk a little bit more about your background. Again, it depends on the research that you've done, because if you do want to convey certain information to the host that won't be summarized in 2 sentences, you may need to write a bit more. But just as an overall rule, you want to start with something that is very succinct in 2 sentences that says right away what it is you do. So starting with I am, or my company does this, or I help people or businesses do this, that, and the other thing. The problem I help solve is always a very good way to start. In fact, I was at a networking event the other day where somebody who was presenting a JVology conference essentially said those very words. What is the problem that you help solve? How can you help solve somebody else's problem if you're dealing with a joint venture? And especially in the case of podcasts, it is the beginning of a joint venture. So you want to think, okay, if this person is giving me the opportunity to use their time and access their audience, might there be something I can do in return? So conveying your message about what you do as the problem you help solve can be a very good way for them to see, hey, maybe there's some way we can have this joint venture partnership where we do something for one another. I'll put you on my podcast and maybe you can help me with this problem that I have. And then finally, especially in business, talking about the results that your clients get. This is a way to demonstrate credibility, which I'll get to in a moment as well. But really just to add that extra bit to a pitch that shows you're not just talking about something, it's not just, this is something you've been trying to do. It demonstrates that you've actually put it into practice and you have clients that are getting results. So the credibility factor, essentially you're answering the question from a podcast host point of view, why should I choose you? So at the top of the list, I always suggest demonstrating the years that you've been doing what you've been doing. The more years of experience, the more credibility you have. Do you have independent confirmation about you being an expert from other media? This is so important. If you can be in an independent, credible media source, like a television program, like a magazine, or even if you were on another social media channel where you had the host had tens of thousands of followers and is very picky about who they put on. Being in any of those channels demonstrates credibility and makes it easier for a podcast host to say yes to you. What about your followers? How many people do you have? Do you have a tribe that has just a few hundred? Maybe you're not really, haven't really established yourself in the market and I might want to stay away from you for now. Or do you have several thousand or tens of thousands? That demonstrates credibility. Education and degrees. While it's important, and there's certainly certain professions where you actually, it's essential for you to have the background, it's not always as important as those first 3 factors when you're dealing with different media outlets. So if I were looking to interview somebody who was a counselor of some sort or somebody who's a lawyer, for sure I need to know, what's your professional background and what's your education around this. I don't want somebody who just decided that they were going to call themselves a counselor but doesn't have any formal education. Again, the results that your clients have, that can demonstrate great credibility. If I can put in a media pitch that I've taken 25 companies that were under $1 million and increased their revenue into 6 and 7 figures, I want to talk to you because that's great. That demonstrates to me you actually walk the walk or walk the talk, as I say. And then finally, do you have authority that can be demonstrated by the books that you've written? Do you have a best-selling book? Have you been part of a book with other authors? Even though writing one chapter in a book might not appear to be something that's special, the fact that you were selected to do that among probably many other people who wanted to be in that book means something. It demonstrates your credibility, and especially if that book did go on to be a bestseller. So number 4 is where we get into the interesting content about what you're presenting. So something that's really new, changing, or connected to a trend is so important for any media outlet. If you can bring information that others need to know within a certain industry, especially if this is something that the hosts don't know themselves. So if you present something in a pitch and you make the host say, wait, well, I didn't even know that. This is the person that I want to talk to about it because they're really on top of things. If you have a unique perspective about a specific topic, especially if it's trending, that's super important. And if it makes you stand out as an expert in your field. So a lot of people are trying to do that. They want to be seen as the go-to expert. It's not enough to say, I've done this for X amount of years. It's not enough to say, I have these results. You have to really bring something a bit different that says, I'm so much the expert that I know things as they happen. I know the new things as they're going on, and I'm going to teach you about it. And then another very important thing is if what you have to say is very timely. I use the anti-spam legislation as an example because this was something that pretty much all businesses who do email marketing needed to know, and they needed to know by a certain date. And so pretty much anybody who was an expert in that area was being interviewed on all kinds of different media. So if you have that kind of expertise about something that's very timely and you demonstrate it in your email pitch, the host is going to respond and be interested in talking to you. And as well, if there's something fun that you can bring to the interview, something a little bit quirky, as I said earlier, it's got to be appropriate. I find this very often is relevant if you have a unique perspective on an issue. Sometimes you can bring in that entertainment value that the host will be looking for. The transferable lessons. So this is where you have to think in terms of what it is the host is trying to give to their audience. The host is not just sitting there interviewing people to fill time. They have a lot better things to do. They're always wanting to teach something to the audience that's listening. Some podcasts might be just entertainment. If you're somebody who interviews celebrities, for example, that's an area where there might not be transferable lessons. But especially if you're working in the business realm, if you're teaching people about health, trying to convey information about fashion, how to buy homes, there's so many different areas where the transferable lessons become really key. And something to be really cautious of, though, when you are selecting the podcast that you want to pitch to and when you're doing the interviews, you don't want to give everything away. So while you might have a lot of lessons that can be taught, you want to give people enough information that they're going to be curious to learn more, but not give so much away that they walk away thinking they've learned it all. Because ultimately, if you're trying to access podcasts or other media in order to gain more prospects, in order to gain more clients and more leads, you want them to be curious enough to contact you. So you don't want to give so much information that they're not going to feel the need to look you up and contact you to get further help. Now, this is the part I mentioned that's a little bit kind of intangible. It's often the hardest thing to get across, and for some people, they may not have something to put in there, but I urge you to give this some thought. Something that makes you a little bit different as a guest that will make you stand out. So let's say, think about a podcaster, a host who's getting 10 or 20 emails a day with people wanting to be on their podcast. So they'll open the emails usually based on subject line. Or if you're pitching within the website of a podcast, which is very often the case. So they'll open it up, read through the pitch. And let's say yours really sounds like somebody else's that's pitching the same material. The difference could be made in the selection based on what is it that makes you a bit more special. So it could be something about you specifically, maybe something you overcame in your background that will make an interesting story to talk about. Maybe a challenge that you overcame during your business that will make the transferable lesson more interesting. Or maybe it's the number of people that you bring to the podcast. Again, as I mentioned, again, you know, podcasters aren't doing this just to fill time. They also want to spread their brand and make sure a lot of people get the message out there for whoever's going to be on the podcast. So if you can say, you know, I'm going to bring 2,000 followers or 10,000 followers who are going to be listening to this, or you know that you can post the podcast afterwards on your channels that have in total 15,000 people, this could also be relevant and tip the scales in your favor. So now I want to get into the actual pitch. In this case, it was a pitch online. As I mentioned, a lot of podcasts, when you go to their website and they have the contact button, you don't actually see their email. You would actually just see a form that you fill out. So this is a way to present yourself if you've got knowledge about a specific topic and you want the podcast to be about that topic. So the first thing at the top, you can see one sentence of what you're requesting. I mean, it's an online form, so you could be requesting anything. As a person who works in media, I might be requesting to do an interview with that podcast host for an article that I'm writing. You never know. So you want to be clear. You're looking for the host to choose you as a potential interview for the podcast. And right away, your expertise is going to be a great benefit to the audience. So 2 sentences here. This is a client of mine whose focus was on CRM, customer relationship management. And we explain in 2 sentences why, what he does and how his business helps clients. You can read this for yourself in terms of what the content is. But below that, I want to show something that's interesting as well, and that is around the area of titles. Now, I put this in because a lot of times you can use the same pitch when you are pitching to different media outlets. So this is actually something that was used in a pitch to a newspaper. And if you think about podcasts, they actually do have titles to the podcast. Sometimes they have the name of the guest, and sometimes it's the name of the guest with the title, and sometimes it's just the topic or the title of the podcast. So I suggest to my client to put in some possible titles. So reasons why marketing automation is no longer nice to have, just nice to have. Risks of not using a CRM system in your business. So you can imagine if you went on to the site of a podcast that dealt with issues for small business or entrepreneurs, and you're scrolling down the topics and you see risks of not using a CRM system in your business. If you are somebody who'd been considering CRM, or even if you haven't and you see that there's a risk for not using it, generally entrepreneurs are risk averse. And so that could get a lot of attention and generate a lot of clicks on that link. 5 things you didn't know about CRM that you could do for your business. This is what's called listicle in media. So if you have, you know, your top 10s, do this or that, or 3 reasons why you should do this, or 6 steps to doing that, all those are called listicles. And that's a cross between list and article. And so 5 things you didn't know about CRM. People are often drawn to this because they know it's going to be very structured and easy to take away the transferable lessons. And then again, I said to him, well, is there an issue that you can relate to money? Because this was also used as a pitch to do an expert column for a business newspaper, which was accepted. And so when you're thinking about entrepreneurs, when you're thinking about business, being able to even use the word money in your pitch somewhere, in this case, how much money our business is leaving on the table, that will draw attention as well. Now, don't leave all the content to be covered in the lists. The reason is, if you're pitching to media and the recipient doesn't find the exact fit in the list, they may think, okay, no, this person isn't appropriate for my podcast. So I suggest further information put in bullet point form. So below these titles, further on in this pitch, I had the client write out a few other topics that he could cover that were more broad. So how CRM turns your business into a marketing machine, CRM providing metrics and reporting. So again, you're basically just demonstrating to the recipient how broad your knowledge base is. This gives credibility. This means that you can actually fill the content of a podcast. If the person you're pitching to has a podcast that might go on for an hour, they need to know that you have enough information to cover that. So they could take all these points. They could take the titles that I mentioned earlier. They could take all these different points and make questions to ask you during the interview, and they'll know that you'll be able to answer them and fill time. After that is where I suggest somebody put in why you would be a great guest for the podcast. And then at the bottom we have more information, sample audio clips, again, demonstrating credibility and giving the podcast host an opportunity to listen to you in a different scenario to see if you would be somebody who would be good to interview. And then finally, you sign off with your name and contact. Now, this is a pitch that I sent. This was a warm lead, and basically I went to a networking event and stood up and asked people if there were interesting podcasts that they listened to. It was a business event, and I asked for a podcast that had to do with business information. So in this case, I felt a little bit more chatty, and you'll see some of the information that I gave is a little bit longer than 1 or 2 sentences. And I didn't put it in bullet points because I felt that having that sort of warm lead connection meant that the recipient is going to take a little bit more time to read it. But I want to jump right in to demonstrate that there's a synchronicity between what I do and what the content of the podcast is. And as it turned out, the result of this email, he contacted me right away, and we got together for coffee and had a great conversation, and in fact created a bigger joint venture partner to go ahead beyond just the podcast. So it actually resulted in a better opportunity for me. So the first thing I say, I've listened to your channel. I love the balance you have between people's personal stories and the development of their business. So right away I say, not only do I know who you are, but I've actually listened to the podcast and I understand your content. And having listened and understood the content, I can see that I would be a great guest. We actually have another friend in common. Both of us, myself and Bijan, have worked with Iman Agai, and I demonstrate that, you know, I don't know if it's going to mean anything. I saw that Iman was actually one of the podcast guests. And in fact, this was interesting because I looked at several of the recent podcasts, but then I scrolled down just to see who the guests were. This is a great idea because if you can see a guest who you know in person, if this was a cold lead, you might be able to contact that guest, if you know them, and ask for an introduction. A really, really great strategy. And at a minimum, if you're not really sure that person knows you well enough to give an introduction, listen to the podcast and try and work them into the pitch. So demonstrating that you have this friend in common or this acquaintance in common, demonstrating that you've listened to the material, and, you know, maybe just saying how you know that other individual just creates a little bit more of a relationship. And if you recall back when I was looking at showing the first slide, building the relationship with the podcasters is so important. Even more so, I think, very often than building relationships in other media, like the editor of a website or publisher of a website, or the editor of a newspaper or magazine, or a radio producer. Those very often you can pitch to them and have them say yes or no right away. You may not really feel you need to build a personal relationship. Whereas many podcasters like the idea of having that personal relationship before they will say yes to you. Now here's where I get into a bit more. You can see the paragraphs are longer. I just thought, I think the introduction that I gave, if it piqued his interest, he would read this a bit more because he wants to get a real feel for who I am. And it turned out to be true. When we met for coffee, he actually said to me, when I read through the material you sent, I could sense that there was a way that we could work together. So it was really important for me to give a little bit more background. So there was a bit more detail in the background that also demonstrated credibility. I'm not just throwing out, you know, oh, I was born in this place and I went to school here or there. Everything I put is strategic. So my background to show credibility in journalism, the fact that I work for Glacier Media and Business in Vancouver, not wanting to go on too much, I give a link to my information on my site. Then I get right into the credibility, third-party credibility in terms of a course that I was teaching at Small Business BC. And then what I do for people. So the last paragraph there you'll see is about launching the business and how I'm teaching people to do their own media outreach. So as I mentioned earlier, this particular podcaster likes to talk about how you as a business person might be helping other people. And so after I saw that as the part of the content, I actually put that and referenced it in my pitch. So this again, sorry, this is a repeat of the content I had above, and the last couple of paragraphs demonstrate why should the audience care. I've been looking for opportunities to spread the word, how easy it is for people to get interviewed, how you can raise your credibility in the media. So I'm showing what his audience will get out of listening to this podcast. What are they going to learn? What are the transferable lessons? And then finally signing off, I think it's good for any business, small or large, for standing out in the crowd. And I hope you see this as a relevant interview. So this is, as I mentioned, a second example when you have a bit of a warm lead and you've done your research by listening to the podcast, so you get a really good feel for the information that the host is looking for. That's so important to demonstrate that synchronicity so the host feels they're making a good decision when it comes to selecting you as a podcast guest. Now, when they call. So here is what I think is one of the biggest advantages of a podcast. If you're being interviewed by phone, which is most often the case, or even sometimes it's done on Zoom now, or a video, I guess what you call a video cast, a video interview, where you're not actually on television, so you can actually have notes beside you. So this is where you can be really prepared and have the notes available for you to refer to. So first off, you want to be clear on what the messages that you want to get across are. You don't want to leave the podcast and then think later on, oh my God, I forgot to mention my course coming up. Or, oh, you know what? I forgot to mention this key point that people really need to hear. or this is the key challenge that people have. This is the key pain point. This really speaks to people and I didn't bring it up. Have it written down. If you're doing a telephone interview, you can actually read it from your page. Practice doing it so it doesn't come across as kind of doesn't sound like you're reading it. But if you want to make sure you get the words right and the message is correct, have it written out in full. So looking at the media outlet to see, as I mentioned, what they did beforehand, looking at listening to the interview, hearing the way the questions are asked, being prepared for the questions. So if you listen to this, Bijan, who did this podcast, when I listened to it, I heard that in every podcast, there were personal questions about that person's background. So I know to be prepared for a question like, how did you come to do this? Or why did you select this career? Or, what were some personal challenges that you had to overcome? Very often people get stymied, they think about business challenges, but if somebody were to say to you, what personal challenges did you have to overcome in order to be able to get to this point? You don't want to stutter and say, oh, let me think about that. I'll get back to you. Can't do that. You have to have the answers ready to go. If you get a chance to talk to the host beforehand, even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes before the podcast, but ideally a day before or earlier, try and get the questions that they are going to ask. So this way you can actually write them up and practice giving answers. Again, you don't want to sound like it's automated, but just feeling comfortable in doing the interview. Also, if you can contact the host beforehand, ask them if it's something that's going to be live or pre-taped, and can you get a copy? As I mentioned earlier, having a copy of the podcast, being able to download it and put it on your own site is really crucial to make sure that you have it for as long as you want it and you don't have to worry about putting a link to somebody else's page that might disappear. Then you want to practice a little bit regarding how you actually answer the questions. So, as I said earlier, interviewers like answers that are very tight and to the point. Put one thought or two thoughts in. Make sure you're answering the question. I can't say how often I've asked people questions and they just go off on a tangent and I have to come back and it sounds really bad. Like, well, you didn't actually answer my question, so we have to now ask it again. Keep them tight. Allow a break for the host to come in and ask their question. So one of the ways to do this is once you've answered one question or finished a point, just pause for a couple of seconds. If the interviewer doesn't step in and ask another question, be prepared to go on. You don't want dead air. While it's true that a podcast or pre-taped interview can be edited, nobody wants to have to edit. Nobody. It's always easier to be able to take the product and just put it online or take the product and put it to air. It's the same thing as myself with an editor or when I was a producer in radio. Yeah, it's possible for me to edit your piece, but that takes my time. So if you can be a good interview and you're going to give me a completed product where I don't have to do anything to it afterwards, that's great. That's more opportunity to be asked back. If I were dealing with writers, especially freelance writers, if they gave me material and I had to do a lot of editing to it, think of this if you want to write a column for a newspaper or magazine, or if you want to write a blog for another person's blog. If they have to do a lot of work on it, they're likely not to ask you back. But if it comes in very clean, then there's more chance that they're going to go to you the next time they want to have a discussion about a particular topic. When it came to people sending me columns, if somebody sent me a column that was very clean, and I had another feature section, let's say, that dealt with that issue, I would just go back to them. And I used the same columnists over and over the course of a year, because I knew that they would send me something in that was complete, and I could basically take it, put it on a page, give it to a proofreader, and that's all that had to be done. Practice, practice, practice. Don't just go to an interview unprepared and not having practiced, unless you have done a lot of interviews and you feel super confident. But if it's your first or one of the first you've done, get a friend to just ask you questions. Call up, even if it's just 10 or 15 minutes. Just say, listen, I'm going to be on a podcast. This is the topic. I want you to ask me questions. That person doesn't have to be an expert in the field. In fact, most of the time, podcast hosts are not experts. That's why they have guests on, because they want the guest to be the expert. So you don't need to find anybody with a particular background to help you. All you need to do, if you've done your research and you have some ideas of the questions they're going to ask, you can feed the questions to your friend to help you. But I would suggest you actually have your friend not be prepared, because that way they'll throw questions at you and you won't know beforehand. And so you won't necessarily be prepared for the answers. Or maybe they can mix it up a bit. So they'll ask you a question that you've already prepared, and maybe another question that you haven't prepared for. But getting somebody to help you do this is really, really great practice, and will make the interview go that much more smoothly. Oops, sorry. So actually there's supposed to be another slide. I think I deleted. The final thing is going to be where you're going to post this information. So as I mentioned in an earlier slide, once you get that podcast downloaded, hopefully you can get it to your site, you want to take it and as soon as possible, put it somewhere where people could link to it. If you get a video, put it up on Vimeo or YouTube and throw it into social media. You can increase the credibility and market it by using the podcast host name. So if they're well known, like, hey, I've been interviewed by Gary Vaynerchuk, people are going to click on it. But otherwise, use the topic, use whatever it is. If there's a key point in the actual interview that you think people would be interested in, put that information into the actual body of your marketing. So if you're putting it on Facebook, for example, just put that in the description in your post. Make sure you put something in that's going to draw people. Don't just say, hey, I was interviewed on a podcast yesterday, here it is. Give people a reason to click on it. And what this will do, besides marketing for yourself, if the podcast host sees an uptick within 24 hours of the podcast being published, and you start getting more and more and more people clicking on that podcast, they're going to call you back. Because one of the things media really responds to is if they see their audience clicking on your information and being engaged in your, whether it's an interview you've done on television or an interview on podcast or a guest blog on their blog post, if they see an uptick in it, they are going to get back to you because they want to generate engagement. And if you can help them do that, you're going to be much more attractive to them to be interviewed. So that's basically it for today. I am just going to, let's see, stop share here and see if anybody's on who has any questions. Hey, Lynn, how are you doing?
Good. Hi, we have Doug here too.
Hi, Baila.
Really good material. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Have you been having success with your interviews and getting some more followers and response from other editors? What's been happening?
Well, we've had success with the interviews. We haven't done too much going forward on trying to get other other media. But I had a question or two about your presentation today. Would it be okay to ask that?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. One of the questions when you talked about listing your experience and your degrees and things, we're really to the point where we have so much experience and so many degrees and
Yeah.
so many years. Does that seem too much or too old or overwhelming?
Well, you don't have to worry about too old if you're not demonstrating the years. So,
Okay.
you don't have to say from, 1972 to 1977, I did this. You're not putting in your resume. And yes, definitely you can put too much in.
Okay.
So I would estimate maybe a couple of hundred words. Actually, I'm just going to stop this.